These are Rocky and Sunspot. They like this gel food, foraging, and contemplating their own reflections. But one thing they don't like is this ugly light, or at least I'm not a fan. For one thing, it just makes everything look kind of green and nasty, and there's no way to adjust the color spectrum. There's also no way to adjust the brightness, so the only options we have there at the moment are off and maximum brightness. Being able to turn down the blue light might also help cut down on algae growth. After taking a closer look at how the light was constructed, I decided it wouldn't be too difficult to swap out the stock LEDs with some RGBW LEDs and give my fishies the proper lighting that they deserve. There are lots of reasons to seek a custom lighting solution for your aquarium. For one, aquarium lights are ridiculously pricey, and if your aquarium came with a light like mine did, then you can upgrade it for a pittance compared to buying a new light outright and feel good about not having to throw away good materials. If you're setting up a new aquarium and don't yet have a light for it, constructing one from cheap or even salvaged materials is simple. Or maybe you have very niche needs with a solution that isn't readily available on the market. Maybe you just want the satisfaction of building your own light from scratch. In this video, I'll show you how I upgraded my aquarium light and incorporated it into my smart home system. By building or upgrading your own light, not only can you incorporate the ability to adjust the color spectrum and brightness and implement all kinds of automation, but you'll have full control over the materials, dimension, and overall quality of the build. My build is relatively modest and, to be brutally honest, not the best to look at, but it's a highly affordable option that provides everything I'm looking for. After the build section, I'll walk through my brightness ramping script in Home Assistant that simulates a natural sunrise and sunset. I'll also provide links to the YAML code for you to drop into your own setup if you're using Home Assistant. Finally, I've included a section for those who might want to go even further, where I walk through how to install custom firmware onto your LED controller that can handle the ramping functionality directly on the device. I'm just going to do a quick run through of all the essential supplies you'll need. The first is going to be some kind of housing for your LEDs. Just something to put them inside of. I also highly recommend some kind of LED rail. Going to need a power supply, of course. Going to need a controller for your LEDs. I recommend the Shelly RGBW2. You're gonna want a junction box, most likely, to keep your module and your wires from getting wet, since this is a wet application. And generally, just you want to keep your wired connections sealed off in case there's any arcing or whatever. You're gonna want some LEDs. I like these because not only are they RGBW, but they are also waterproof. You're gonna want some wires. They sell these easy clip-on wires. Do recommend those if you're not good at soldering, like some people, me. This brand of LEDs also comes with wires soldered onto the ends, so you may not really need to buy extra wires at all. And you're gonna need screws to secure your junction box to your housing. I start by removing the LED rail. It's pretty straightforward, just a couple screws on each end. You can see how unwaterproof this is. No heat shrink wrapping or anything around these. These wire grommets will naturally put up some resistance, but some gentle, steady wiggling will coax them out. You may need some pliers for these bigger clip-style grommets. Here I'm picking out the right size of cable gland. It's It's going to need to fit both the LED cables and the power supply cables. Here I'm trying to find the best spot in the junction box to drill a hole for the cable gland. The LED channel is going to be here. So if we can get it as far over to the side as possible while still not getting too close to those threads, we can just make it work. Here's a trick I've found for marking a rough center for a cable gland hole. I've relocated outside for this next part where I'll be cutting, clamped up my piece nice and tight. Got my drill with a stepper bit ready to go. I'm just gonna slowly do a few turns in the middle just to make a little divot first. Let's send it. Moment of truth. Plenty of room for our backing. So my initial plan was to go here. So it looks like I might just be able to squeeze it in on this side. We're also going to have to remove this little stand thing. It's just in the way. I don't even really, maybe it was so you could put in a longer strip here, but it's gonna have to come out. Now we're back inside and we're gonna screw this on. Wipe that real quick. So we're definitely not flush here. There really was no good placement option, I don't think, for this particular housing setup, but I think it'll work for me. It'll be a little raised up a little bit, but that's fine. I don't think anyone will notice. I'm just gonna move forward. Now, before we move on to actually installing the LEDs, I'm going to wire them up with the Shelly RGBW module just to test that everything is working as it should be. In most cases, the ground wire of your power supply should be marked with a dashed line. But just to be sure, you can always use a multimeter to check. Make sure you're measuring DC voltage. If your voltage reading is negative, then you know that your red probe is touching the ground wire. We're going to need to splice the power cable to the controller module and the LED strip itself. For this, we're going to need a little wire nut and a third strip of wire. The Shelly module includes a little AC adapter, which we won't need for this project, so I'll repurpose one of the wires from that to use as the splice wire. Combine the line wire from the power supply with the voltage in wire from the LED strip and the splice wire we created earlier. When the Shelly LED controller first starts up, it'll create a Wi-Fi access point. We can connect to that to test our lights and to update our Wi-Fi credentials. Now that we have our light working, we can integrate it into our smart home system and create scripts and automations to adjust the brightness throughout the day, to give the fish a more natural light cycle. Now, before we jump into Home Assistant and start writing our brightness ramping script, there are a couple things to think about. The first thing we need to consider is the shape of our ramp curve. Technically, there are infinite options out there, but the ones that actually make sense for this application fall under a few umbrella categories. The simplest option is the linear ramp. This ramp just increases the brightness at a constant or linear rate. The result looks unnatural and mechanical, as just about nothing in nature forms a straight line. So while it's easy to implement, I'm going to rule out the linear ramp from consideration. As the Earth rotates during the day, the amount of light that hits any point depends on how directly it faces the sun. For this reason, the curve that most closely resembles a natural daily brightness cycle is that of the sine function. A sine curve is an excellent choice for our brightness ramp, since it most faithfully mirrors a natural light cycle. Moving along, we have the S-curves. This family of curves, perhaps the most famous of which is called the sigmoid function, is defined by being symmetric about its inflection point. S-curves closely resemble the way that the eyes of humans and other animals actually perceive changing brightness, so they look much more natural. An S-curve ramp also gives off less light overall than a sine ramp, which may be beneficial in an aquarium setting as it could be another tool to help curb rampant algae growth. Since it's the most straightforward and natural-looking option, I'm going to implement a sine curve ramp for our demonstration. However, there's one more thing we should take into account before we get started. This is one possible light schedule we could use for our ramp. The brightness follows a basic sine curve from our chosen sunrise time to our chosen sunset time. While it might seem fine at first to have one long-running script, continually updating our light over the course of the day, I would recommend against this approach for a couple important reasons. Our script will need to update the light frequently to make a smooth curve, from each minute to even each second or faster. These frequent updates of course require compute cycles on your Home Assistant server and take up network traffic on your home Wi-Fi network. Additionally, if our light loses connection to the server before the script finishes execution, it may end up stuck in an undesired state. The longer a script runs, the more opportunity there is for it to fail. For these reasons, I recommend creating separate ramp up and ramp down scripts, each about an hour long. This reduces the total ramping time, meaning less server load and network traffic overall, and gets your light into safe states, either fully on or fully off faster, reducing the risk of the light getting stuck due to script execution or network errors. I've created Home Assistant scripts for both the S-curve and sine functions. They can be found over here in the GitHub repo that I created. Make sure to leave a star when you get here and head over to the scripts folder. Find the ramp that you want and copy that code. Head on over to Home Assistant and head to Settings, Automations and Scenes, over to Scripts and hit Create Script. Switch into Edit and YAML mode and paste in our code. First, you'll notice we have a direction variable. This determines whether the ramp is ramping up or down. We have a delay time variable. This determines how often this repeated sequence here is run. We have a step count variable, which determines how many times this sequence is run. And we have this peak brightness variable, which decides the peak brightness for each channel of our RGBW light. So we're going to change the step count to 50 just to test out the light. And before we test it out, we are going to update this line with our actual light ID. Hit Save Script and Run Script. And once you have your ramping script, all you need to do is create two automations, one to call it in the morning and another to call it in the evening. You can set the variables of your script directly from within your automation. That way you only need the one script, as you can just set its direction depending on which automation you're writing. I've even created a light schedule playground where you can experiment with different ramp shapes, steepnesses, and ramp and hold times. This provides a hands-on visual way to develop your perfect lighting schedule. This system works well in most cases most of the time, but we can even go a step further to get a system that is more robust against issues like the one I mentioned previously, where scripts can fail and cause the light to get stuck in an undesirable state. The solution I'm referring to is a custom firmware for ESP8266 based LED controller modules like the Shelly RGBW2. This firmware is based on the popular Tasmota smart home firmware, and I created it with the specific purpose of aquarium lighting in mind. It implements a daily brightness ramping cycle directly on the device and provides MQTT T-hooks for editing light cycle parameters and overriding the ramping functionality, all from within your smart home system or via the device's web portal. If you're interested in this, stick around for the next section. If not, no worries. You already have a light that works and does everything you want it to, and that's great. Before attempting the firmware flashing process, make sure your light controller is disconnected from mains power. I'm removing mine completely, but that's just because it made this section easier to shoot. The firmware flashing process can be a little intimidating the first time, but it's pretty simple once you've done it once or twice. There's plenty of information about the process on Tasmota's Getting Started page. Another reason that I chose the Shelly RGBW2 is that the manufacturers included an external header which makes flashing the device with alternate firmware so much easier. However, the Shelly's header slots are too small to accept normal-sized DuPont-style jumper cables, which makes the process a little bit trickier. I'm using 26-gauge solid core wire and a breadboard to connect it to my USB UART bridge. I'm using my Flipper Zero as my USB to UART bridge, but there are definitely cheaper options out there. However, the lack of an animated dolphin companion makes most of them inferior. Once we have our bridge hooked up, we can start the flashing process. Make sure to wire the GPIO 0 header and ground header together to start the device in flash mode. I like to use Adafruit's ESP Tool browser utility for my firmware flashing needs. If everything has been hooked up correctly and our device has been successfully booted into flash mode, then we should be able to establish a connection. Then we can just locate our binary and click Program. After a successful flash, disconnect the GPIO 0 pin and briefly disconnect the power pin to restart the device. The Tasmota setup process is similar to the stock Shelly firmware. The device will create a Wi-Fi access point which we need to connect to, then we'll add our Wi-Fi credentials to the device to include it in our network. If everything is in order, we'll automatically be switched back to our home Wi-Fi network and taken to the home page for the device. At this point, we can safely assume that the firmware flashing process has been a success. So let's go ahead and disconnect from our UART bridge and plug our light back in. The next thing we need to do is configure the device template. This will tell Tasmota what the pins of the device are supposed to do. The template for the Shelly RGBW2 can be found in the Tasmota docs. Head to Configuration, Configure Other, paste the template into the template field, check Activate, and hit Save. After the reboot, you should see some new controls have appeared on the home page. You'll notice that the new controls don't do anything except maybe cause the light to flash. This is expected behavior because, by default, the light is controlled by its ramping schedule. To test that everything is working correctly, we'll need to override the default behavior. Head over to the console. We can increase the log level to get updates about the state of the light cycle. Type in weblog 3 and hit enter. Enable override mode using the toggle override command. Now we can update the light's color manually with the update override color command, which takes an RGBW value. Hopefully your light should change to the corresponding color, but if it doesn't, you may need to return to the home page and hit the toggle button. Next, we can update the sunrise time to test the ramping functionality. But first we should update the time zone setting. Tasmota provides a docs page listing the appropriate commands to set the time zone for your region. Let's set our ramp time to 1 minute so we can observe a whole cycle. Run the command update ramp time 1. Then we can update our sunrise time to 1 minute from now with the update sunrise time command. After 1 minute, the light is ramped up to its full brightness. The light has a peak hold time of 0 by default, so the ramp down phase begins right after the ramp up phase is completed. If we want the light to hold at its peak brightness before ramping back down, we can adjust the peak hold time with the update peak hold time command. We can change our peak brightness color using the update peak brightness command, which also takes an RGBW value. By default, the light uses a sine wave ramp shape, but we can also use an S-curve or even a linear ramp, although I don't recommend it. Use the command update ramp shape 1 to switch to an S-curve ramp. We can also adjust the steepness of the S-curve ramp using the update steepness command. The light can also be controlled from within your smart home system by adding it as an MQTT client. You can create an entity to toggle the override and set the color of the light from within Home Assistant by adding this code snippet found in the README of the Firmware repository to your configuration.yaml file. Make sure to update the code snippet and your Tasmota config to use the same MQTT topic. After restarting the Home Assistant server, the new entity should be available through the MQTT integration. Thank you so much for watching. Since you've made it this far, I'll send you off with some peaceful footage of Rocky and Sunspot enjoying their new light. If you have questions, concerns, loved the project, hated the project, whatever, don't hesitate to leave a comment below. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe and stick around for the next project.